Beware of China's exit bans and the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. And the Millennial joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer. This podcast is called Beware of China's, quote, exit bans, end quote, and the dumbest bill in America. What is an exit ban? Well, China's figured it out. In the Hill magazine, Hill newspaper, China allows American brother and sister to leave after 3 years. China has allowed a pair of American siblings to return to the United States after being held for 3 years. American siblings, podcast listeners. In a statement to The Hill, a State Department spokesman said the agency's consular staff in Shanghai helped facilitate the departure of Cynthia Liu and Victor Liu on Sunday. Quote, we welcome Cynthia and Victor Liu's return to the United States on Sunday. Our consular staff in Shanghai helped facilitate their departure, the spokesman said. Quote, we made this confirmation only after close consultation with the family, end quote. The statement further said that the U.S. opposes the use of coercive, quote, exit bans against people who are not themselves charged with crimes. We will continue to advocate on behalf of all American citizens in the PRC subject to arbitrary detention and coercive exit bans, the statement said. In a travel advisory to China, the State Department warns that China uses exit bans and arbitrary detentions for a variety of reasons, such as pressuring family members to return to China from abroad and to gain bargaining leverage over other foreign governments. In most cases, U.S. citizens become aware of exit bans when they attempt to leave, the advisory warns. There is no reliable mechanism on legal process to find out how long the ban lasts or how to contest the ban in court. Cynthia Liu had worked at a New York consulting firm while Victor Liu was a student at Georgetown University when they visited China in 2018, 3 years ago. According to CBS News, the siblings went to visit their grandmother, but were later barred from returning to the United States. At every border point, their father, Liu Changming, was linked to a $1.4 billion fraud case and had fled in 2007, CBS noted. The release comes after China released Canadian citizens Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor after the U.S. struck a deal to drop its extradition case against Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou. So, you know things are pretty serious when the United States State Department says that you shouldn't travel to China. At least they say that there is a travel advisory because you might be banned from exiting China. Now, of course, the United States has a travel advisory, obviously, with North Korea. You know, it's like, don't travel to North Korea. Don't travel to Venezuela. Don't travel to these places because bad things may happen to you. And either because the economies and the countries are fundamentally incredibly dangerous, or you might be used as an international pawn in a way of gaining advantage over your own country. So in China, they might use you to try to gain leverage with the United States government to give the Chinese some sort of advantage on the international scene. Really kind of scary. So here's the thing. If you are an international traveler or an international businessman, businesswoman, and you're traveling to China and you're able to go and come and go as you please, chances are you're probably doing something that the Chinese government likes. You know, the PRC, they probably like what you're doing. And that's probably not necessarily so good for your country. So in the Wall Street Journal, China's hostage triumph. The U.S. lets Huawei's CFO off easy, and Beijing frees 2 Canadians. Westerners working in China are officially on notice. You could be arrested on trumped-up charges at any time and used as hostages to promote Communist Party interests. That's the message from the humiliating U.S. surrender to China hostage diplomacy in the case of Huawei chief financial officer Meng Wanzhou. Canadian authorities arrested Mrs. Meng in 2018 at the request of the U.S., which charged her, with bank and wire fraud under a deferred prosecution agreement reached Friday. Ms. Meng was allowed to return to China without going to trial. She merely admitted to facts she had previously denied. Shortly thereafter, and right on cue, China released 2 Canadians it had arrested on phony charges not long after Ms. Meng's arrest. So in the United States and Canada, you have rule of law. You break the law, you are arrested, you have your day in court. But in China, there is no rule of law. So they're going to use Americans who are innocent Americans just traveling China, visiting family members, visiting relatives, trying to do business in China. You're going to get arrested potentially because the Chinese want to use you as a pawn to trade with the West so that they can get these criminals who are committing crimes actually in the U.S., including espionage and other things, and get those people back. China's immediate release of businessman Michael Spavor and former diplomat Michael Kovrig proves their arrest was a hostage taking to pressure Canada and the U.S. over Ms. Meng. In China, the law serves the party, but in the U.S., the law is supposed to operate independent of political interests. This DPA is embarrassingly weak. Ms. Meng admits in a statement of facts that she failed to tell the truth to a multinational financial institution about Huawei's business dealings with Skycom, a company controlled by Huawei that did business in Iran. Skycom had been suspected of seeking to violate U.S. export control laws, and Ms. Meng was dispatched to reassure the financial company. So, obviously, Huawei, which the President of the United States, the former President Donald Trump, banned from building 5th-generation wireless networks in the U.S. because of the surveillance state the Chinese company would have engaged in on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. That same company is engaged in all kinds of espionage across the world. And then this Ms. Meng engages in this kind of espionage among other financial shady dealings, and she gets arrested. And the Chinese are like, no problem. We're going to just arrest innocent Americans traveling in China, and we're going to use them as bargaining chips. And if you don't release Ms. Meng, who actually is a criminal, we're never going to release these people over here in China. We're not going to necessarily jail them. We might not, but we're certainly not going to let them leave. So also in the Wall Street Journal, China releases two U.S. citizens blocked from leaving in 2018. This article is pretty much the same, and it just talks about this idea of China's exit bans. And so you must be aware of China's exit bans, because when you don't have rule of law, you have a government that controls every aspect of the economy. This is, by the way, podcast listeners, why I, as a conservative, don't like our government getting so big, which of course it is, because the government eventually does what? It controls every aspect of the economy. And this is very dangerous. And we see this happening in China, where you don't have rule of law. Why do you think people come to the United States? What is the principal reason? Because there is no rule of law. You don't have a day in court. You can be arrested for no reason and for any reason. You can be detained for no reason and for any reason. You really don't have a free and fair economy, because you have crony capitalism, which, by the way, exists in a big way in China. The cooperation between the large corporations in China and the Chinese Communist Party, do what they tell you to do, everything's fine. Choose to be free and operate freely, you will be arrested. In fact, you'll probably be ousted from your company, and the Chinese Communist Party will just take it over after you did all the work building the company. This happens all across the country, not just in communist countries, but also in autocratic countries like Venezuela and Cuba and North Korea and so many other places across the world, where whatever you've built can just be taken away from you for any reason whatsoever. That is a lack of rule of law. And so when you see the tens of thousands of people marching towards the border in the United States, particularly the southern border, Why are they doing that? Well, in large part, not always, it's because they're escaping the lack of rule of law and they just want a fair chance at a better life. Unfortunately, there also are those who come to the United States because they're coming here for the free stuff. So next up, podcast listeners, Jen Psaki talks about higher taxes and higher prices. Pretty extraordinary thing that she did this, but let's give you a little background information first. First, President Biden tweeted out just a couple of days ago. He said, this is President Biden himself. This is his tweet, because of course he can have a Twitter account, but Donald Trump can't. It says, my Build Back Better agenda costs $0. We talked about this yesterday, but this is an actual tweet from the President of the United States. My Build Back Better agenda costs $0. Instead of wasting money on tax breaks, loopholes, and tax evasion for big corporations and the wealthy, we can make a once-in-a-generation investment in working America, and it adds $0 to the national debt. My God, podcast listeners, can you believe this? A $3.5 trillion spending bill that actually is going to be well in excess of $4 trillion when you add infrastructure and all the other costs associated with this bill, because I don't believe the Congressional Budget Office for one moment that it's only $3.5 trillion. I'm sure by the time it's fully implemented, it'll be $5 trillion at least. Biden is saying, my Build Back Better agenda doesn't cost anything. Instead of wasting money on tax breaks and loopholes and tax evasion for big corporations and the wealthy, we can make a once-in-a-generation investment in working America. This is how the Democrats are trying to buy off the middle class by saying it's the rich people. When, of course, we all know what's really happening here. We know that everybody's going to be paying more. Proof that everybody's going to be paying more? Jen Psaki was asked a question at her press conference just yesterday. And the press conference, of course, engaged in one key question. What about this not going to cost anything idea that you Democrats are throwing out there? And what about the fact that when the government spends so much money, it causes inflation? And when the government decides to tax a lot more, not just with big companies, because we know it's also medium-sized and small companies as well, will that affect prices? So does government drive price increases as a result of tax increases and as a result of spending? And I think the answer is pretty obvious. We'll talk about that in 1 minute. But first, here is an exchange with reporters, the White House press corps, and Jen Psaki over this very issue. Listen closely. Here it is.
I want to ask you about what Republicans are pointing to in the analysis from the Joint Committee on Taxation. They say, according to, if I've read the chart correctly, more than 16% of taxpayers would see their taxes increase under the bill that's approved by the House Ways and Means Committee. Will the president sign that bill as it is coming out of that committee, or will he insist on the changes so that he will maintain his commitment that taxes won't go up on people making $400,000 a year?
I have not looked at the document or the report that you have put out. Obviously, the president, or that you have referenced, I should say, that the Republicans put out. Obviously, the president's commitment remains not raising taxes for anyone making less than $400,000 a year. There are some, and I'm not sure if this is the case in this report, who argue that in the past, companies have passed on these costs to consumers. I'm not sure if that's the argument being made in this report. We feel that that's unfair and absurd, and the American people would not stand for that. But I will take a closer look.
Yes, it's unfair and absurd. Unfair and absurd, according to Jen Psaki, that companies might increase their prices to consumers as a result of the companies having to pay more in not just income taxes, but all taxes across the board, and also the cheap money that's out there that's driving the inflation as well. So this is kind of interesting, right? We have runaway inflation in our U.S. economy, and the U.S. government wants to continue to spend, which is going to cause more runaway inflation. And then in addition to that, Jen Psaki says, it is unfair and absurd that any company would even think of raising their taxes, think of raising their prices to consumers for their products as a result of us taxing them more. And so in the Wall Street Journal hits this bill, which is Joe Biden's bill. And of course, Bernie Sanders takes a lot of credit as well, the $3.5 trillion bill, and says it's full of subsidies for the upper middle class. So once again, the bill is all about buying off constituencies. President Biden is trying to rescue his $3.5 trillion tax and spend plan by playing the class card, claiming it will help working people who are struggling to pay their bills. This makes it sound like a safety net program for the poor rather than what it really is, a government subsidy engine for everyone, including the affluent. And so here's the thing. The bill includes an expanded child tax credit, which has become a monthly government check that transfers large sums of money from childless taxpayers to financially secure middle-class families. This allowance is now $3,600 per child under the age of 6 and $3,000 for ages 6 through 17. A married couple making $150K a year with 4 children, 2 under age of 6 and 2 above, would qualify for a $13,200 a year child tax credit. And in addition to that, the Democrats also want paid family leave, about 2/3 of average wages for up to 12 weeks a year for any family care. So up to 12 weeks a year. It would also apply to both full and part-time employees. In the case of newborns, both parents would be entitled to leave. This means a married couple with a newborn, each earning $200K, Mr. Biden's definition of a rich household, could each collect more than $1,000 in weekly benefits, resulting in $24,000 of paid leave in 1 year. A couple making $100,000 each would be eligible for roughly the same amount. So here's my point, taxpayers. Who's actually working? Who's left working in the United States of America to pay for all this stuff? Pretty much nobody. We're paying people not to work, so they're not working. And then we're paying people more money who are working to not work because they're having children. I mean, this is part of the problem when you are trying to, first of all, having children is a good thing. All right. But what we're doing here is we're saying, hey, you can make all this money and we're still going to pay you to not work up to 12 weeks. You don't have to work. And I'm not talking about the mom who wants to take off 12 weeks. They're saying the dad too. So the mom and the dad take off for 12 weeks and they're going to get paid at the same time. The bill includes a huge new $12,500 electric vehicle tax, which of course goes to whom? The rich, because the rich can afford those nice little EVs. And they think it's really trendy too, so they get the tax break. And the biggest subsidy of all may be the return of the state and local tax deduction. Speaker Nancy Pelosi has promised her members meaningful relief above the current $10,000 cap. Only some 15% of taxpayers itemize their tax deductions, and most of those would benefit from a higher cap, and they happen to be the affluent in the rich coastal states of the East Coast and the West Coast. So as you recall, the Republican Party under Trump, when there was a Republican Congress, got rid of this state and local tax deduction thing because state and local governments were raising taxes uncontrollably. And they were the federal government said, oh, no problem, keep doing that. And you get to deduct all of that expense of your local tax and state taxes from your federal taxes. The Republicans got rid of that. Democrats want to bring that back so that they can reward who? The rich and the upper middle class. And here's the thing. It's also rewarding, and here's the big problem. It's rewarding irresponsible spending at the state level. That is the most egregious part of this entire thing. And I just can't understand why this continues. It just really shouldn't. And there's also an article that I really wanted to discuss with these podcast listeners because it deals directly with the central issue of entitlements in the United States of America today, which is, by the way, also driving illegal immigration. And we know that, right? You keep expanding the entitlement state, and at some point, the word gets out to the rest of the world that you can move to the United States, not necessarily just for the opportunities, not necessarily just for the opportunity to a better life if you work hard, but also for the free stuff, the free healthcare, the free entitlements. In the Wall Street Journal, we have an opinion letter. The entitlement state failure has many fathers. It has been a bipartisan drive down to the road to serfdom. And I believe this is from the editorial board. It's pretty extraordinary that they wrote something like this. And it's very timely, of course, given this $3.5 trillion expansion of the entitlement state. Of course, by the time all the money is spent, it'll be $5 trillion because it's going to be far more than the $3.5 trillion. In this excellent column, The Destructive Legacy of the Great Society, Jason Riley correctly assigns primary responsibility for the shift in attitudes regarding underprivileged Americans to the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson. The 36th president deserves a healthy share of the blame, but he's not alone in responsibility. Before the Great Society, welfare officers often refused welfare benefits, including housing to families with two parents, thereby creating powerful incentives for the father in the house to disappear. So let me read that again. Before the Great Society, welfare officers often refused to give welfare benefits, including housing to families with two parents, thereby creating powerful incentives for the father in the house to disappear. The tragic stories of fathers hiding when welfare officers came, and of children forced to lie and maintain that they had not lately seen their father, both antedate and run current to the Johnson presidency. The courts played their part, particularly in Goldberg versus Kelly in 1970, in which the Supreme Court ruled that welfare payments were a kind of property, thereby institutionalizing Professor Charles Reich's then radical concept of entitlement. President Richard Nixon, who succeeded Johnson, further institutionalized modern welfare by signing off on significant expansions, most obviously in a dramatic increase in the availability and distribution of food stamps. The same dynamic continues more strongly in Washington today. The Biden administration's cradle-to-grave entitlement plans, the Supreme Court's ratification of the Affordable Care Act, and Republican proposals for expanding entitlements under the guise of refundable tax credits are only a few of the many examples of the partisan drive down the road to serfdom. And this was written actually by, let me see, Amity Shlaes, the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. Ms. Shlaes is also the author of The Great Society, A New History. So this is really kind of interesting. It really is both parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, podcast listeners, who have both decided over the period since the Great Society to expand in a massive way the entitlement state. And this is so dangerous. This stuff is so dangerous, what has happened. So we have entitlements for the affluent under the Democrats in this new $3.5 trillion plan. And we have the entitlement state failure that just continues. Used to be the failure in the inner cities, still is, by the way, where you see housing projects and food stamps and gambling operations. You know, it's, oh, let's make the economy better in the city. Let's bring in the casinos. Yeah, that really helps the poor, doesn't it? And there's just this constant road to serfdom in the inner cities. And now, of course, we see that we're importing the poorest of the poor across the world because they're like, well, wait, they're giving all this free stuff away in the United States. Why wouldn't I come to your country for the free health care in particular? There's no one better than that. There's no one reason better than that. So next up, podcast listeners, Liz Cheney has headed to New Hampshire, and she plans to go there in November, sparking a 2024 speculation for presidential competition. So Liz Cheney, who is not going to get elected or reelected in her own state of Wyoming, has decided, well, what the heck? If I'm not going to get reelected in Wyoming, I might as well run for president of the United States. What makes her think she's going to actually win the nomination in the presidency of the United States in the Republican primary if she can't win the primary in her own state? Well, I guess that's what happens when you're a professional politician and all that matters to you is being reelected and reelected and reelected, and you realize you can't really do anything else. And you derive most of your income and your power from being a full-time politician. So that's the Cheney family, right? In a move that will spark speculation about potential national ambitions, Republican Representative Liz Cheney of Wyoming will headline an awards dinner later this autumn in New Hampshire, the state that for a century has held the first presidential primary in the race for the White House. Cheney, one of the world's well-known and vocal members of the small group of GOP lawmakers and leaders opposed to former President Trump, will be the featured speaker at the annual Naki S. Loeb School's First Amendment Honors Program on November 9th. The former president and his allies have backed a primary challenger to Cheney when she's up for re-election next year in Wyoming, as Trump aims to oust Cheney from Congress. The school was named after its founder, the late publisher of the New Hampshire Union Leader, the state's largest newspaper, which was first to report the Cheney visit, noted that the event honors individuals or groups who have in some extraordinary way exercised or sought to protect the Constitution's First Amendment rights of free speech, assembly, press, religion, or government petition. Cheney, in a statement, said she was honored to participate. Protecting our First Amendment freedoms is at the heart of our responsibility as elected officials, Cheney wrote. I look forward to helping to recognize New Hampshire's citizens and organizations who are working to defend those freedoms. And the union leader says, U.S. Representative Liz Cheney, whose independence has cost her the enmity of Donald Trump, as well as her Republican Party leadership post, will be the featured speaker at the Naki S. Loeb School First Amendment Honors Program in November. Now, you would think that this paper, the union leader in New Hampshire, would instead invite the people across America who some are, the classic liberals and most are the conservatives, who are complaining about and standing up to the censorship on Twitter and Facebook and the national media, both print and the mainstream media. That would not be Liz Cheney. They are celebrating her because she is anti-Republican Party. She's anti-conservative. Why wouldn't you invite to your, annual meeting and your annual ceremony, if you will, people that are actually trying to fight for the freedom of speech? Because Liz Cheney is not doing that. She's just fighting against the right enemies, which of course are Donald Trump and the American people, the so-called deplorables. But the thing is, we have this incredibly systemic problem in the U.S. where we have people who are trying to get their voices heard on social media, and they can't. They can't because they're being banned. They're being censored, of course. And this is happening all across the country. But no, let's bring Liz Cheney in. So anyway, I just thought podcast listeners, you would appreciate that. Liz Cheney is going to New Hampshire to speak and put her foot in the water and test the presidency in the Republican Party, which she will never, ever ascend to. She'll never get the Republican nomination. So there's a Georgia congressional district plan that could help the GOP grab a seat in Georgia, which is good, right? A House of Representatives seat is up in Georgia because an initial proposal to redraw Georgia's congressional districts appears to give Republicans a better chance of winning a suburban Atlanta congressional district now held by a Democrat named Lucy McBath, but raises a number of other questions. So the Republicans, if they redraw this district, will indeed most likely pick up this district. And of course, the Democrats in Georgia are freaking out. It's like, oh my gosh, it's not fair. And then also in political news across the country, in Politico magazine, an article, people are going to get skittish. White House sweats over McAuliffe. The governor's race in Virginia could shape the outlook for the midterm elections. Democrats can't afford a loss. President Joe Biden can't afford Terry McAuliffe to lose the governor's race in Virginia, and the White House knows it. It's a scenario the president and his aides and close allies increasingly view as a real possibility given the tightening polls in the race and signs of Democratic apathy. The White House, Democrat National Committee, and outside partners are closely coordinating with their efforts and speaking almost daily, according to 3 people familiar with the dynamic. Just over a month before Election Day, they are planning to ramp up activity and engagement in addition to the $5 million DNC has already budgeted for Virginia, one of the people said. They know what's at stake. A loss to Republican Glenn Youngkin in the official cycle governor's race could set off a domino effect. So Virginia has an off-cycle governor's race, gubernatorial race in Virginia. Their races are odd years, and that makes it a full year before the Democrat and Republicans' 2022 epic election cycle, which of course is even years. But in Virginia, it's odd years, so every single state legislator in Virginia is up for election or re-election this November, as well as the governor and the lieutenant governor. So Democrats are panicking and thinking that this is the case. It's 2009 all over again, the year they lost the state's gubernatorial race, followed by a wipeout in Congress. Democrats fear the party will lose faith in the idea that Biden's agenda will help boost their electoral prospects, that they'll fret about this broader handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, and even question the embrace of vaccine mandates as an electoral cudgel after it found favor with a wide swath of Americans. Quote, there should be concern. It's a close race. If Terry loses, that's going to scare a lot of Democrats on the Hill. It's going to make people worry about the midterms, and it's going to make it harder to pass the president's agenda, said Josh Schwerin, a Democrat strategist who has worked as a McAuliffe political advisor and former press secretary. People are going to get skittish if we lose this. It would be the wrong reaction, Schwerin added, but it would be the reaction nonetheless. A source familiar with the White House thinking said officials always anticipated a close race in Virginia, noting that Biden himself suggested so when he stumped for McAuliffe in late July. Among their concerns is the number of undecided voters in the contest, said another familiar source with conversations between White House aides and the National Democrat Party leadership. Virginia has trended Democrat in recent years, no doubt, with Biden winning the state by 10 points. But if voters remain on the fence as the election approaches, it gives Youngkin the type of opening he would need. Quote, of course, I believe the White House is concerned, said Chris Corge, a national finance chair at the DNC who is close to McAuliffe. Knowing Terry the way I do, though, this guy is tireless. He never stops. He'll pull it out. He'll win. But it's going to require him running a near perfect campaign. So here's the problem with Virginia podcast listeners, in as much as it is true, and Politico, of course, is a left magazine, but in as much as it is true that Terry McAuliffe is a very good campaigner and a former governor of Virginia as a Democrat. In Virginia, you can't, by the way, hold office as governor 2 terms in a row. You can only have 1 term, and then you have to take a break, and then you can run again. You can't have 2 consecutive terms. So Terry McAuliffe was the governor just a few years ago, served a term. He took off, and the Democrats called in this old hack, this Clinton hack, because they know that Terry McAuliffe will do exactly what they want. And they're hoping that Virginia is not just trending blue, but will remain blue. So they're terrified that Virginia, the legislature may flip back to Republican and the governor may flip back to Republican. And here is why that might happen. Not just because Youngkin is a decent candidate. I honestly don't think he's a great candidate, but he's a decent candidate. I think because of all of the school board nonsense that's going on across Virginia. And in Virginia, you also have the large bases, huge bases, military bases, especially Navy bases in Virginia. And many military people are very, very unhappy with the Democrat Party based on what happened in Afghanistan. They're not happy at all. And so when you combine that, all of those military voters, with the fact that you have the school boards in Virginia who are telling parents, shut up and obey, and the school boards in Virginia that are telling the parents, we're going to teach critical race theory whether you like it or not. You have a lot of parents who actually are in the middle of the political spectrum and even slightly left of center who are just saying, no, I might actually vote for a Republican in Virginia, even though the state has been turning and trending blue. So the Democrats are freaking out because if this were to happen in 1 month or so, that is to say, if Youngkin, the gubernatorial candidate, who's the Republican nominee in Virginia, pulls us out and defeats Terry McAuliffe, the Clinton hack, that will definitely be a bellwether for 2022, and Democrats are going to be terrified. So, case in point, in the Hill newspaper, Democrats see Harris, the vice president of the United States, as a major player in the midterms. Democrats expect Vice President Harris to be a major player, revving up the party's liberal base, I'm pretty sure you mean progressive base, ahead of next year's midterm elections. Well, there's no doubt about that, of course, because that's why they bring in Harris. They brought her in California. She shored up the progressive base, and they're going to use Harris for that same purpose. Not going to send her to the border, right? They're not going to actually let her talk to the media where she has to have a press conference because she can't do that because she's a complete idiot. But she is very good, no doubt about that, of stirring up the progressive, far left, crazy base of the Democrat Party to get them out to vote. And that's what they're going to use her for. So Democrats see Harris as uniquely positioned to drive up turnout among young people and women who they believe will be critical to Democrats retaining their majorities in Congress. Historical trends suggest that Republicans should have an edge in the midterm elections, and Democrats say a strong turnout will be key for the party to keep power. She is very popular with the base. She is particularly strong with women and with young people. Turnout for young people is going to be critical for the midterms elections, and it's uncertain, said Celinda Lake, a Democrat pollster who advised President Biden's campaign. Between turnout and swing independent women, I would think she would be quite aggressive because of her own appeal and popularity. So be prepared for Kamala to be brought out of the shadows of the Biden administration and instead brought to the campaign trail. But what's going to happen is, this is what I think it's going to backfire, because the more Kamala is exposed in these kinds of campaign events, the more likely someone from the press is going to have an opportunity to ask her a question. And it'll be a really important question, I'm sure. And she'll do her usual laughing thing. It's like, well, Kamala, what about the people on the border who in squalor are living there? Don't ask me that question. Because that's usually what she does, right? And that's going to backfire. Clearly, that's going to backfire. And why wouldn't it? Because Kamala Harris is an empty pantsuit and always has been. So next up, podcast listeners, there are new rules that are being set up by restaurant and hotels. It's kind of a human interest story and small business story. Restaurants and hotels are pushing back against an uptick in consumer tantrums. So now, you know how you've seen on some of this video of people on airplanes and they just kind of like freak out, or people who are jumping on the case of others when they're in a library and telling them, you shouldn't be wearing that shirt. I've been triggered. Oh my gosh. Well, restaurants, the same thing's kind of happening in restaurants where people are becoming very belligerent of waiters and waitresses. And remember, these restaurants have suffered unimaginably through COVID. And then as you get out of the pandemic and they're allowed to actually host customers, in some cities, you got mayors saying, well, your customers must have vaccine passports, which is quite frankly, and I rarely cuss on this podcast, but that's bullshit. This is private property. These are private businesses. Sorry, you don't get to tell the restaurants who their customers are. You don't get to segregate people. So then there's that. And then, of course, you have people who are in the restaurant business and many other businesses who are employees who are being paid not to work by the federal and state government. And so the restaurants are having great difficulty finding people to work inside their restaurants. Despite all that stuff, now you have the customers who are just cranky beyond belief, probably because of COVID fatigue and the fatigue of all of the nonsense that you're seeing on TV all the time. They're just done. And they go to the restaurant and they start mistreating the employees, which doesn't help with employee retention, right? Doesn't help at all. So in the Wall Street Journal, restaurants and hotels are pushing back against the customers who are throwing these tantrums. Chris Sirianni typed 4 words in capital letters, hit print, and taped the message to the front door of his restaurant. The printout said simply, "Be kind or leave." In the weeks since Mr. Sirianni put up his sign at the front of the brewery at Union Station in Erie, Pennsylvania, as well as on Facebook, customers have acted better. While it didn't eliminate problem customers entirely, it has curbed what has been a mounting display of bad behavior, he says. Not one has been outlandish or belligerent, he says. Perhaps most important, the paper sign sent a message to staff. General Manager Caitlin McCarthy, who has been called lazy and berated for long waits and unavailable crab cakes, says staff no longer feel like they have to walk on eggshells. The note also included a short paragraph saying his employees have been through hell and back and deserve better. By the way, imagine, podcast listeners, going to a restaurant and you order crab cakes. Let's say the table next to you orders crab cakes, and the waitress says, "I'm really sorry, we don't have crab cakes. I know it's on the menu, but we're out of the crab meat." And then the people just go crazy. Well, here's one of the nuances in the restaurant business. I know this because I have a relative that's in the business. Crab meat and the cost of goods and the cost of food in the restaurant business, it's through the roof. So if you're in the restaurant business and you try to just get the crab meat, it's very difficult to justify how much money you're paying for it. And then you got to do that little tape over thing on your menu, or just reprint out the menu, and the prices just keep changing, because the crab meat itself, as an example, is so expensive. And it's so expensive because the people who catch the crabs, who then turn the crabs over to the crab pickers, it's very hard to find those people because they're being paid not to work. So the restaurants are getting hit from every angle. And so then you have the customer and the table next to you saying, "I can't believe you don't have crab cakes. How can you not have crab cakes? This is ridiculous. I mean, this is just absurd. And the thing is the price is really high anyway. How can you not sell?" And then the waiter's just like, "Dude, look, I'm just trying to do my job. Take your order. And, do you have any idea what we've been through?" So restaurants and others in hospitality businesses have long espoused the customer is always right and all are welcome. Now many are rethinking that philosophy thanks to a surge in toxic customers and poor behavior. And there's a link to that. So I have to touch that. It says adults are throwing tantrums in restaurants, planes, and at home, and you can blame the pandemic. And there's a whole nother article about that in the Wall Street Journal. So anyway, podcast listeners, you get the point. When you go to a restaurant, especially, all right, of all places, a restaurant, it's probably the single place more than any other business in America, restaurant and bars. Those are the single places that you can go to that have been hit the hardest during the pandemic, and as we are out of this pandemic, are continuing to be hit hard, because now inflation makes it even more difficult for them to earn money on the food that they sell to you and the drinks that they sell to you. So then they have to keep changing the prices. That ticks off the customers. And then sometimes they just choose to take stuff off their menu because they can't make money on it, because the prices are so high, and then they can't get people to work. So therefore the service is reduced. You're used to great service when you go to these places, and then you get angry because you have somebody who's waiting on you, who's probably also waiting on 10 other tables and can't really keep up because there aren't enough people. So I like that saying. Be kind, or we're going to kick you out. So next up, podcast listeners, we have the dumbest bill in America. And do we have a lead up, Mr. Producer? Here it is. And it is the dumbest bill in America, and it is tree equity. Tree equity. Folks, don't you know what tree equity is? You know, like the trees that are outside that you sit under, that are shady, that when the wind blows, you hear the trees, blowing back and forth and leaves back and forth in the wind. Well, there needs to be tree equity because some people don't have as many trees as you do. So we're going to socialize. We're going to create socialism for trees. And we're going to call that tree equity. Here's CBS 46 in Atlanta reporting about this. And first, please listen to the reporter on CBS 46 in Atlanta, as she actually is not reporting. She's actually advocating for equity for trees. Here's the clip.
New at 6 here in Atlanta, it's something we take for granted. Tree cover serving as a map of race and income. Researchers now using our environment to build community demographics. Now here in Atlanta, neighborhoods can be very different from one to the next. I want to show you this map here. This neighborhood in Midtown scoring 100. Well, not too far away down in Vine City, this neighborhood scoring a 48. What do those numbers mean? It's called a tree equity score, and it adds up to a number of factors that shape a neighborhood and how trees are the common denominator.
Yes, and she started out building community demographics with tree equity. How do you see? This is how Democrats, I think, just ultimately win so many times, because they lie so much and they manipulate the English language so much. Here's the reporter advocating, you just heard her advocating for tree equity in Atlanta, Georgia. And she says, and tree equity builds community demographics. What does that mean? You build community demographics with tree equity? How about something simple like, I don't know, you're going to actually just plant a couple of trees because you like trees, because no one's stopping you from planting trees. I'm pretty sure you can do that anytime. And you can also move to a place that has more trees. And we're going to get to that, argument in a minute. So again, this dumbest bill in America is tree equity. And so here's more on tree equity on CBS 46 in Atlanta. This is the same reporter interviewing some folks and then talking about it. We have that clip, and here it is.
In this city, in a forest, Atlanta neighborhoods are not created equal, even when it comes to our most abundant resource, trees.
Trees just really aren't high on the list of things to be looking at.
Greg Levine, co-executive director of Trees Atlanta, has seen the disparity from one community to another. And a recent nationwide tally of trees, known as the Tree Equity Score, digs deeper into the difference. Researchers found that neighborhoods with a majority of people of color have a third less tree canopy than mostly white communities. And neighborhoods with 90% or more residents living in poverty have less than half of the tree canopy that more affluent communities do.
Ah, yes, tree equity, ladies and gentlemen. So now we hear what it's really about. It's about dividing people once again by race, dividing people by class. And that's basically saying that because you live in a city and you live in the part of the city that is high density, there aren't enough trees. And somehow that is because of racism. And I got to tell you, that's complete and utter BS. Want to know why, podcast listeners? Because when you go to any city anywhere, all along the street, you have those rectangular shaped planting areas where typically there would be a tree. Sometimes there's a tree. Many times, I will readily admit, there is no tree there whatsoever. But nonetheless, there is that rectangular shaped area with soil and dirt in it that is built into the sidewalk, and it's flush with the sidewalk. As you walk on the sidewalk, along the street, on the sidewalk, and you'll see maybe no trees there along there. Guess what? Anyone can plant a tree in that. You can plant a tree there. No one's stopping you. I'm sure if you called up your city and said, hey, look, if I planted a tree there, would that be okay? And they would say, yeah, we don't have the, granted, we planted trees there before and people keep stealing them, or we planted them there before and people keep urinating on them and killing them. We planted trees there before and, people destroy them because they keep hitting them or they park on the sidewalk. There are many reasons, right? Why there are no trees in those areas, but there are places to plant them. So these are the same places that the tree equity advocates would say that we should be planting trees. What's stopping the community from doing it? Nothing is stopping them from doing it. Nothing. And by the way, this has nothing to do with money. You can buy a sapling for about 99 cents. In some cases, in many cases, you can call the National Arbor Foundation and they will send them to you for free. For free. But of course, this is part of the Democrat playbook, which is tree equity. It's got to be, you don't have the same amount of trees as they do. And this is part of the idea of getting socialism in every aspect of our economy. Every aspect. So in the New York Post, Biden's Democrats' $3.5 trillion spending spree, $3.5 trillion spending spree includes money for tree equity bias training as well. The $3.5 trillion spending bill being pushed by President Joe Biden and congressional Democrat leadership includes a $3 billion tree equity outlay for planting saplings. Saplings, folks. So this is what a bunch of crap this is, right? I mean, I know you have to build, in order for a tree to get big one day, it takes many years, right? Depending on the tree. Some trees grow really quickly, some trees don't. But it's not like they're going to use this money to plant like mature trees in these communities. They're going to plant little tiny saplings. So guess what? The individuals in those communities could do the same thing. They don't need government to do that for them, but they've chosen not to do it for a whole variety of reasons. And the $3 billion outlay for planting saplings and $25 million on anti-discrimination and bias training in the healthcare industry, as well as $79 billion for the Internal Revenue Service. Yeah, of course, because, if you don't plant trees, saplings, then you might get audited. The $3 billion earmarked by the House Agriculture Committee would be doled out to state, local, and tribal governments for tree planting and related activities and to increase community tree canopy and associated societal and climate co-benefits with a priority for projects that increase tree equity. According to the conservation nonprofit American Forest, tree equity refers to the idea that there should be enough trees in specific neighborhoods or municipalities for everyone to experience the health, economic, and climate benefits that trees provide. Trees are more than scenery for our cities, American Forests say on its website. They are critical infrastructure that it's infrastructure now, that every one person in every neighborhood deserves, a basic right that we must secure. So tree equity now is a thing that we're going to talk about to separate people from the suburbs and people who actually live in the cities, to try to divide them even further. And then to convince them that that's why we need socialism. Everybody now has to have the same amount of trees. You shouldn't have that right to own that house in the suburbs that you've worked your entire life for. You can't keep that. So in Fox News, $3.5 trillion spending package includes big money for tree equity, bias training, and more. So nearly $79 billion for the IRS, $12 billion for electric cars, $3 billion for tree equity, $1 billion to turn government facilities into high-performance green buildings, and new funding for gender identity issues and bias training. So the tree equity, the Democrats are also putting equity at the center of the bill. The Agriculture Committee has earmarked $3 billion for tree planting program with a priority for projects that increase tree equity. The legislation dishes out another $4 billion for neighborhood access and equity grants. So in other words, folks, these are programs that are going to pay people to do a whole lot of nothing, provided that they actually vote for the Democrat Party. So you heard us talk about Atlanta with respect to tree equity. Well, here's WBAL in Baltimore reporting about the same thing. Here it is.
That's things from increased utility bills, health aspects, property values. All of those things are affected in communities with lower tree canopy. And that is certainly something that we see in our poorer disenfranchised and minority communities here in Baltimore.
He says in more affluent areas that have more tree canopy, you see higher property values, fewer human health impacts.
Ah, yes. Baltimore, of all places. You have an expert there that says, you see that property values are higher when you have more trees. No, folks, that's really actually not true. Because you see, as a general rule, when you live in a city, the property values tend to be much, much higher, except in cities like Baltimore, where you have crime rates that are so high, not just in the so-called difficult neighborhoods, but throughout the city. The crime is terrible and the schools are awful. I'm talking about the public schools are awful across the city of Baltimore and many of the major legacy cities across America. And that's why people don't want to live in those areas. Would you want to live in an area where you can't walk out your door, but you would fear getting shot or worse, killed? Would you live in an area where the schools are really bad, the public schools? Would you live in an area where there's trash on the street because people don't think that they should have to put the trash in a garbage can? Would you live in an area where people don't care about the way their houses look? You know, and the same areas that we're talking about are areas where legal immigrants came 100 years ago and more to Baltimore City, and they were so proud of their neighborhoods. They were so proud to be homeowners. They took amazing care of their homes and amazing care of their neighborhoods. And those are the same neighborhoods that are completely in utter disrepair because of tree equity, is what they're saying now. What a bunch of nonsense. So I have to finish this podcast and this particular dumbest bill in America with this clip for you. Here is Delegate Brooke Learman. She's a Maryland state delegate who's now running for comptroller of Maryland. And Brooke Learman is from Baltimore City. And there's a bill in the Maryland House of Delegates that dealt with the climate and the climate crisis. And the same delegate, Brooke Learman, who voted for all of the legislation to cancel the police in Baltimore City. You know, she says, no policemen. We don't want policemen. Crime is through the roof. It's spiked through the roof. People are dying everywhere, including children. And the schools are terrible. The city's falling apart. Everything about the city isn't working. Everything that's supposed to be working isn't working. And that's where she represents. And so she decided to get up on the floor of the Maryland House of Delegates. And what did she talk about? She's talking about the trees. Tree equity. Tree equity will keep you safe. We have that clip, and here it is.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And if my colleagues will indulge me for 2 quick minutes, I just want to celebrate something in this bill that hasn't been mentioned thoroughly, and that's going to have huge and immediate positive impacts on all of our constituents. And that is that we are going to plant 5 million trees in this state under this legislation. That is going to have immediate public health benefits and reduce public health costs for our citizens, for our residents. It's going to have a remarkable impact on our homes and the value of our homes, and even on crime. There are numerous studies done in Maryland showing the direct correlation between decreased crime and increased trees.
Typical politician, right? She could, at any time in her political career, and that's, by the way, it's the only thing she knows how to do is to be a politician. She could, at any time in her political career, go out and buy some trees, some saplings, which are very inexpensive, as I've said before. And she could take those saplings and she could plant them in Baltimore. And she could do that right now. She could solve the climate crisis. And she could also solve the tree equity issue as well. But that's what happens in the Democrat Party. It's all talk. They could solve the problem today by just going out there and planting. But they choose not to. It's all talk. It's all government. It's all about programs. It's all about control. It's all about socialism. It's all about equity of trees. And that is the dumbest bill in America. And that's it for Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.